The purpose of this video is to provide the viewer with an example of how conjoint analysis can be used to understand people's preferences for a given product. To help illustrate this, we designed a conjoint study about the consumer landscape for golf balls. We used some sophisticated methods to create a simulated sample of people who took the survey. And so during the video, we're going to use these simulated results to illustrate how conjoint analysis can help marketers, product managers, and others make better informed market decisions. Let's talk a little bit about conjoint analysis. The goal of conjoint analysis is to learn about consumers' preferences regarding the combination of the features or the attributes that make up a product or a service. And this is accomplished by asking people to express their preferences by choosing a concept from a set of concepts. There are three main steps in a conjoint study: design, analysis, and simulate. In the design phase, we are breaking down a product into its corresponding attributes and levels. We then create a set of product profiles, and we ask people to choose between competing realistic options, and we're always varying the product features and the prices, and then we record what people choose. This approach gains us information that far exceeds concept testing, and it avoids the problem where people say everything is important to them. In the analysis phase, we are quantifying people's preferences by determining the relative value or utility of the attribute levels that make up a concept. The result is really a set of preference scores for each attribute level included in the study. In the simulation phase, we build a model from the choices that people made in the conjoint analysis. We can then run what-if market simulations to allow managers to test feature or pricing combinations in a simulated choice environment to predict how consumers would react. Let's talk about the golf ball study. The purpose here was to determine the value that buyers place on each of the individual attributes when purchasing a box of dozen golf balls. So we had 4 attributes in the study, and each attribute had different levels or characteristics. From a brand perspective, we included 4 brands: Callaway, Top Flight, Hammer, and TaylorMade. With respect to the feel of the ball, there were 2 different levels that we included, whether the ball was soft or even softer. We had 4 levels of the color of the ball, whether the ball was white, red, yellow, or green, and we tested 3 different price levels: $26, $30, and $35. Take a look at an example of a choice task for the golf ball study. So in this study, there were 10 choice tasks. And in each choice task, all the 4 attributes were represented. And each choice task included 4 concepts. And as you can see, each concept is uniquely different. So what we did is we said, if you were considering buying golf balls for your next outing, and these were the only alternatives, which would you choose? So respondents are asked to choose 1 out of the 4 concepts, or they could choose none. Again, people were asked to make a selection from each of the 10 choice tasks. Let's take a look at some of the results from a brand equity perspective. Here we're seeing that consumers place different value on each of the brands. So the higher the utility score, the greater the relative value placed on the brand. And in this situation, we're finding that Callaway and Top Flight were valued relatively more than the Hammer and the TaylorMade brands. So in this study, we included 2 different aspects regarding the feel of the golf ball. A golf ball could feel soft, or it could be even softer. And here what we're seeing is that consumers place relatively greater value on a softer golf ball. But it's always important to ask ourselves whether all consumers feel the same way. What about males versus females, or new golfers versus seasoned golfers? Segmentation is, of course, important, and conjoint analysis is a powerful tool when it comes to segmentation. What we're seeing here is that males and females differ on the value that they place on the feel of the ball. While males place less value on the softer golf balls, females place greater value on these type of golf balls. What about the color of the golf ball? So remember, we included white, yellow, green, and red colored golf balls. And what we are seeing from this study is that the white and the yellow golf balls had significantly greater value or utility than the golf balls that were green or definitely red. Now, this kind of information has implications for product manufacturing, for inventory management, and for marketing. And of course, there's a segmentation issue here as well. For example, how many people would really be interested in a green golf ball? We'll show you an example later on. So how did consumers feel about the price of a dozen golf balls? What this chart is telling us is that consumers prefer lower prices to higher prices. That makes perfect sense. We're seeing a downward sloping demand curve. Golf balls are not necessarily a luxury item. We are seeing a steep decline from $26 to $30, which is kind of interesting. Maybe there's an inflection point there. And one of the really cool things about conjoint analysis is that in certain situations, we can actually estimate people's preferences for prices that we did not even test in the study. For example, we could try to figure out what would be people's preferences if the price of the dozen golf balls was, for example, $27.99. That's pretty cool. Let's recap what we learned so far. We learned that Callaway and Top Flight were the most valued brands, and that consumers preferred the softest golf balls, but a lot of that preference was driven by female golfers. We learned that white and yellow golf balls are the most preferred, and there are probably implications here for manufacturing, inventory management, and marketing. And we saw that lower prices are preferred than higher prices, but maybe there's a possibility of selling something for just a couple of dollars more. Let's turn our attention to simulations, or what if. So simulations from conjoint data can be used in a variety of different ways. So for example, let's say we want to determine what the market landscape looks like right now for a particular product. As an example, what's the market landscape for a dozen white and yellow golf balls? Or let's say, what if a company wanted to introduce a new product feature and they wanted to figure out how that affects the landscape? So as an example, what if a brand introduced green golf balls? What happens to consumer preference? Or let's say we're trying to determine if another company matches the new product feature that was just introduced. What if brand Y also starts selling green golf balls at the same price as brand X? Let's do some simulations. The first one we're going to do is a market landscape for the white and yellow softer golf balls that I talked about in the previous slide. So let's say the market looks like this. We have Callaway and Top Flight, which we saw in earlier slides, had the greatest brand equity, and they're selling their white and yellow golf balls at $35 a dozen because they can. They have the brand equity. On the other hand, the Hammer brand, it doesn't have as much brand equity, but because its production costs are very high, it has to sell its dozen white and golf balls at $35 a dozen, just like Callaway and Top Flight. In contrast, the TaylorMade brand, they're the low-cost competitor, and they're selling their golf balls at $26. Thus, they're undercutting the competition on price. Let's take a look at the market landscape results. When people make choices in conjoint analysis, that gives us the opportunity to simulate a number of scenarios. And in this case, we're going to simulate the market landscape for white and yellow softer golf balls, which is what I was talking about in the previous slide. And the results from this kind of analysis produces something like the chart that I'm showing you here. So this chart indicates how many people prefer each brand's white or yellow golf balls at different price points. So let's walk through it. If we look at Callaway, they're selling either their white or their yellow golf balls at $35 a dozen. And in total, about 20% of consumers would choose the Callaway brand. For Top Flight, it's a similar result. 19% of consumers would choose yellow or white golf balls if the golf balls are priced at $35 a dozen. Interesting, though, if we look at Hammer. Now, if you recall, Hammer did not have a great deal of brand equity, but they had very high production costs, and so they needed to also market their golf balls at $35 a dozen. And what we can see is that only 15% of consumers would prefer the Hammer brand golf balls. But if we contrast that to TaylorMade, and if you recall, TaylorMade was the brand that was trying to undercut its competition by selling a dozen golf balls at $26. And we can see that 25%, or roughly 1 out of 4 consumers, would prefer a dozen golf balls, be they yellow or white, when the price is $26 a dozen. And the last thing that's on this chart is that we're seeing that about 1 in 5 people wouldn't choose any of these brands or prices. And you may recall from earlier on in this video that in the conjoint questionnaire, we did give people the opportunity to say, I don't like any of these things, or I wouldn't choose any of these options. So let's run another simulation. Let's assume that the Hammer brand discovers through research that some people prefer green golf balls, and they figure out that there's a niche that none of the competitors are filling. And it decides to be the first on the block to introduce green golf balls to the market, and they're going to price them as aggressively as possible. So they decide to price them at $26 a dozen in order to capture market share. And so what we see here are two things. The overall market preference for the Callaway and the Top Flight brands, those decrease a little bit. And the same thing can be said of TaylorMade. They lost a couple of percentage points. But Hammer, because they've introduced a brand new feature and they've priced it quite competitively, they're now the leader in terms of total market preference for golf balls, be those white, yellow, or green golf balls. So the power of conjoint analysis is really excellent here. This is something that you cannot do in traditional market research. That's the power of conjoint analysis. So we're going to run one more simulation, and this one's going to be about what happens if a competitor now responds to the new green-colored golf balls that were introduced by Hammer. And let's assume that we are interested in finding out what if TaylorMade matches the green golf balls. They also introduced green golf balls at $26 a dozen to match the Hammer introduction. What we see here is that, number one, TaylorMade is now the leader again in terms of total market preference for any of its 3 different colors of golf balls. But what we're also seeing is that Hammer is now in second place. They're leading Callaway and Top Flight in terms of consumer preference. So as long as Callaway and Top Flight don't introduce green golf balls, the market position of these brands has shifted. Taylor's in first place, Hammer's in second, and Callaway and Top Flight are relatively tied for third place. The beauty of conjoint analysis is that it gives decision makers the ability to simulate what-if scenarios. What if I introduce this particular combination of features? Or what if I price this product at a slightly different price point? What happens to consumer preferences? What can I anticipate if my competitor does something similar? That's the power of conjoint analysis.